Hello, everybody. We've now come to the third part of our Joseph story. You may remember that Joseph lived in the land of Canaan, but we left him leaving Canaan en route to Egypt. In the first part of our story, we had actually talked about jealousy and pride, but then we came to the second part of our story, which told us not so much about pride and about jealousy, but about being guilty and telling lies and how wrong that was. Just to remind you about that part of the story that we had in the last section, you remember that Jacob, Joseph's father, had sent him to find his brothers. He had 11 brothers. They were herdsmen looking after sheep, and they'd gone a long way from where they lived to find fresh pasture. Joseph had a long journey to try and find them, and eventually he saw them in the distance, and they saw him coming, and they said, "That's that dreamer." They didn't like Joseph because he was his father's favorite and because he had dreams and said that one day they would actually bow down to him. That's why they referred to him as this dreamer. And they thought, we're going to get rid of him. At first, they thought to kill him, but then they thought they would put him in this pit. And when he came, they grabbed him, stripped his cloak off, and put him in the pit. One of the brothers was going to try and release him, but before he could do that, the others decided they would sell Joseph as a slave to a group of tradesmen who passed by who were on their way to Egypt. So Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, and the Ishmaelites start taking him all the way down to Egypt. So we depart from being guilty and lies, remembering that the brothers had gone back to Jacob and they said, "We don't know where Joseph is. We found this. We think it might be his coat. It looks as though he's been attacked by a wild animal." They knew full well that that was a lie. They had put that blood on the cloak, and they knew what had happened to Joseph, but they appeared to be upset. They certainly didn't appear to be guilty and feeling sad for what they had done to Joseph. Instead, they were pleased to get rid of him, and they lied to their father when they said, "We think possibly this may be his cloak." Jacob recognized the cloak, of course. It looked as though wild animals had attacked him, and he was so upset. Joseph, his favorite son, was dead, and he thought he would never, ever see him again. Well, we know, of course, that Joseph wasn't dead. In fact, we can go on to the next part of the story now, where our thoughts are particularly about being innocent, but nevertheless being punished. Innocent, but punished. There's the long journey that Joseph had to take, all the way from where his brothers had captured him and sold him down the road to Egypt. Here he is being led. I guess he must have walked most of the way as the slave traders and the tradesmen took him down to Egypt. When he got there, he was taken to a market. Now, in our way of living, if we want to buy something, we go to the shops, or we want food, we go to the supermarket. In those days, if you wanted somebody to work for you, who you called a slave, you went to the slave market. And you looked at the people who were there, and you wanted to find someone who looked healthy, who looked strong, who looked as though he would do what you told him to do. Because being a slave in those days was very, very hard. You weren't given any wages. You maybe were given some clothes to wear, a bed to sleep, food to eat, and everything else you had to do was what your master told you to do. I don't think you would have had free time or holidays or anything like that at all. You just had to work and work and work. Being a slave was a really hard thing. Joseph had never been a slave, of course, so it was going to be very tough for him. And people came along and looked at Joseph. We think he was about 17 or 18, so he was in good health, probably very strong. And one man came along called Potiphar, and he looked at Joseph and he thought, he looks to me as though he would be a good slave. How much do you want for them? He said to the Ishmaelites. And the Ishmaelites remembered that they had bought Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. So they wanted a lot more than that so that they could make a profit. But Potiphar was a rich man and he was prepared to pay. He was actually in charge of all the armies of Egypt. He worked very closely with the king of that day, who was called King Pharaoh. Potiphar was probably one of the most important people in the country in those days. So he had plenty of money. He bought the slave Joseph and took him home to his very big house. For Joseph, it was not an easy time at all. Here he was in a foreign country. People speak a language that he didn't understand. They had customs that he wouldn't have understood. He'd never been a slave. He didn't know what slaves were supposed to do. It was all going to be really quite a terribly difficult experience for Joseph. I wonder if you've ever been in a country where you don't understand the language. I remember my wife and I went on a holiday once to Bulgaria. We arrived late at night to the apartment where we were staying. And the next morning we decided we better go and find a supermarket and buy some food. But we didn't know where the supermarket was. So eventually we found somebody who spoke some English, told us where the supermarket was, and we bought the food we wanted. When we came out, we couldn't remember which direction we had come, where the apartment where we were staying was. We couldn't even remember the road that it was in. And of course, we couldn't speak any of the language. So it was very difficult. We were very worried for a time. But eventually we found where we were staying and everything was all right. But I think for Joseph, it must have been really, really tough trying to get to terms with living in Potiphar's house. But he worked very hard. He was a good workman. He worked all the hours that Potiphar wanted him to work, and he tried really well to do his utmost, to do the very best that he could. Here he is, I think, grinding down corn to make flour so that they could make bread. He looked after the animals as well. And Potiphar put him in charge of everything that he had, the fields where he grew crops, the animals that he had, everybody else who worked for him. Potiphar made Joseph the man in charge because he was so impressed by the way that Joseph worked and everything that he did and how conscientious he was and how good he was as a worker. I think that when Joseph was being brought up, his father Jacob had taught him about God. And I think because Jacob was a man of God, he wanted his son to follow God as he had done through his life. And so I guess Joseph thought, I want to do the best for God as I live here in Potiphar's house. And he did. Day after day, wherever he was, whatever he did, he had the full responsibility of Potiphar's house. And Potiphar just left everything to Joseph. Well, in Potiphar's house was his wife, and she was very jealous of Joseph. She realized how much Potiphar thought of him and how he was always saying, Joseph, that great slave we got, he's so good. He's always doing the right thing. He works so hard. He's the best person we've ever had. And Potiphar's wife got very, very jealous indeed. And she thought to herself, there's got to be some way that we can get rid of this slave. I don't like him in the house. I don't like Potiphar giving him so much attention, and he forgets about me and doesn't give me much attention at all. So she worked out a plan. And one day when Potiphar was away and she and Joseph were in the house alone, she tried to make Joseph do some wrong things. And Joseph said, no, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm not going to do that because I know my master would not be pleased. And I'm not going to do it because I know that's not what God would want me to do. No, I'm not going to do it. And she tried to make him do it, but he wouldn't listen. In fact, he decided that he was going to run away as fast as he could. That would have been a bad thing for a slave to do, but he thought that's what I'm going to do because I don't want to do things that I know are wrong. And as he ran away, Potiphar's wife grabbed his cloak and had a piece of it. When Potiphar came home, she said, "Do you know what happened this afternoon?" Potiphar said, "What happened?" "You know that Joseph, he's such a good slave. He works so hard," said Potiphar. "No, he's not. He tried to do something that he shouldn't have done this afternoon. He tried to do something wrong. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen to me. And he tried to run away. And look, I grabbed his cloak and part of it was torn off. This is what's happened." She told lie after lie after lie. But Potiphar listened to his wife, and he thought, if that's what Joseph has done, we can't have him in the house anymore. We don't want him as a slave. In those days, if you wanted to get rid of a slave, you didn't try and sell him to somebody else. If he needed to be punished, he probably needed to be put in prison. So Joseph is put in prison, and here he is. Poor Joseph. He hadn't done anything wrong at all. And he knew that he hadn't done anything wrong. He just knew that Potiphar's wife had told lies about him, and Potiphar had listened to his wife, and that's why he ended up in prison. He didn't know anybody there. He didn't know what to do. Again, he had problems understanding what people said because he was only just beginning to learn the language. It was all very, very difficult for Joseph. He'd had a happy time at home with his father, even with his brothers who didn't like him very much. And now in Egypt, in prison, this was the very worst thing that could have possibly happened to Joseph. What will happen to him now? Well, that's the next part of the story. He had done nothing wrong. We know that. He always did what God wanted him to do. We know that to be true. That's what his father had taught him from an early age. And he did not deserve to be punished. People who were in that prison had done wrong things, but not Joseph. He did not deserve to be punished. So what can we learn from the story? What can we think about? Well, here are some things that we might like to think about. We should always do right things and not the wrong things. It's easier to say, isn't it? Easy to write those words even, but to actually do always the right thing and not the wrong thing, to make the right decision and not the wrong decision, is difficult for adults, it's difficult for children, it's difficult for everybody, but that's what we should do. I guess that all of us can think of a time when we have done something wrong, something that we shouldn't have done, probably something that we got into trouble for, maybe at school, maybe at home, but all of us can think of that and think of that because we were punished for doing something that we had done that we shouldn't have done, so unlike Joseph. We should always tell the truth. We know that. We realize that Joseph's brothers lied to their father and Potiphar's wife lied to Potiphar, but we should always tell the truth. I think we can probably again think of a time when we were dishonest and we didn't tell the truth because it's so easy to do, particularly if we're in trouble. But when we're in trouble, we should always be prepared to tell the truth. If we do wrong things and don't tell the truth, we need to say sorry to whoever we have upset. And sometimes we may feel we need to ask God to forgive us when we've done something or said something that we shouldn't have done, when we've been perhaps dishonest, and we need to ask for forgiveness. We need to say we're truly sorry. Sometimes we might think of some words for being sorry, a sort of sorry prayer we could say when we really say, I'm sorry to somebody or sorry to God. So that's the next part of the story of Joseph. The next part after that, Joseph comes out of prison, I have to say, but you'll have to wait to the next part of the story for me to tell that. You're probably back in school now, so I hope the rest of the term will go well. I don't know when I'll be allowed to come back into school to talk to all the children that I normally see in assemblies, but as soon as we can do that, I'll certainly be in your school then. Thanks for listening to the next part of the story of Joseph, and I shall look forward to telling you part 4 as soon as I'm able to. Goodbye.